Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this Curators talk. A very warm welcome in the name of Kunstmuseum Basel and its director, Joseph Helfenstein, and the whole team. I'm happy to welcome you here, or as we say in Basel, Grüezi miteinander. Tonight we have the enormous privilege to be part of and listen to a conversation of some wonderful ladies who have been working on the exhibition of SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP, Living Abstraction. My guests and our guests are tonight Walburga Krupp and Umland, Natalia, Sidlina, and our very own Eva Reifert. I will introduce all of them in a minute or two. We will be talking tonight and hearing a lot of new things, I guess, and a lot of exciting things about the artist SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP, or Sophie Henriette Gertrude Taeuber-Arp. To give you the full name, born in 1889 and prematurely dead in 1943. We all are very excited to hear more about this Swiss artist who was a dancer, painter, sculptor, textile designer, furniture, interior designer, architect, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be an adventurous ride through a wonderfully multidisciplinary practice. A few words to my guests in a second. I want to just mention here at the beginning that, of course, we are extremely lucky at this stage in this rather exceptional times to be able to open the exhibition and have opened the exhibition with a wonderful attendance of publics coming from all over the world. So it's a real personal joy that this has been able, because so much work has been going into this joint project. Present tonight are, and I will start with Walburga Krupp, for curators. This has been a co-curated endeavor over many years. And I just want to say a few words to the researchers and curators who have made this exhibition possible. So Walburga was a curator at the Foundation Hans and Sophie Arp, TAEUBER-ARP in Rolandswerk in Germany. From 1990 to 2012, and during the time of 2014 to 20, she held the position of a research associate at the Institute for Cultural Studies in the Arts in Zurich at the University of the Arts. She's also the co-editor of a book we're all looking forward to, namely the SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP Letters, which will see the light of day very soon, we've been told. So look out for that. And of course, Walburga is also the co-curator of the exhibition itself, Living Abstraction, about SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP's work. Then I want to move on to the very esteemed colleague Anne Umland, who is with us tonight too. She is the Blanchette Hooker Rockefeller Senior Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University in '97, and joined the Museum of Modern Art in '96 as assistant curator first, and has since organized a fair amount of important and wonderful exhibitions on Juan Miró, Francis Picabia, Picasso, and so on. Too many to name them all right now. But I do want to mention something that has been probably becoming very important in these exceptional times, which is a first digital-only publication called Picasso, The Making of Cubism. And it's also tonight that we are, thanks to the digital medium in the position to have this talk. So good to know that the conversation about art is rendered possible also through technology. Of course, Anne Umland and Walburga have been major driving forces for this project, so very happy to have you with us. And then I will turn to Natalia Sidlina, who is curator of international art at Tate Modern in London. She specializes in modern Islamic art and has recently curated Naum Gabo, Natalia Goncharova, and Red Star over Russia, Revolution in Visual Culture, 1905 to 1955. And obviously chaired many programs and publications and so on and so forth. Last but not least, let me introduce my colleague, Eva Reifert. She is our curator of 19th century and modern art here at the Kunstmuseum Basel. She was an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art before, and a curatorial fellow in postdoctoral training at the Bavarian State Painting Collection. I have to read these titles because they're a bit long. And as one of the curators of the SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP exhibition, she has, I would say, the privilege to moderate tonight's conversation. So before we start with the conversation, allow me to just add maybe one information about the timetable. We will start the conversation now with Eva moderating and guiding us through. The conversation will probably last about a good hour, maybe a little bit more. While the conversation is going on, we'd love to invite everyone joining us for this conversation to send us your questions. There is a button in the bottom menu where you can add any questions you want to contribute to tonight's debate. We will take these questions at the end of the conversation, again, when we open to the public. Last but not least, I would love to cite just one person that has been important both for this institution, the Kunstmuseum Basel, for the collection, and last but not least for SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP. And I found a little note which I would like to share with you as a kind of almost impressionist poetic start into tonight's conversation. I'm talking about Georg Schmidt, who was obviously one of our very cherished directors here, a wonderful writer, also a passionate person all through, who wrote in a collection catalog in 1988 that SOPHIE TAEUBER, about SOPHIE TAEUBER, that her every act, and I'm citing here, was an airy light gamble. Her feeling was all gaiety, her thinking all confidence. And he added a little note about the dream that SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP had jotted down, and that dream is a wonderful little motto, maybe, and allow me to end with the quotation of this dream that SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP noted down in 1939, it seems, where she said, "On a sandy beach at the foot of a cliff, my forefinger wrote, as if guided, the word heureuse in the sand. Then it crossed my mind that if the cliff fell and crushed me, the only thing left of me would be the word heureuse." With this, I'm happy to invite Eva to open the conversation. Thank you very much, and everybody enjoy the ensuing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this beautiful introduction, and a warm welcome to you all. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I guess this is the next best thing than actually sitting together and sharing drinks. But this is actually an opportunity that the digital medium offers us, and that maybe before we haven't taken advantage of enough. So we're just going to see this as something that we can make good use of in these interesting times. First things first, I guess, Anne and Walburga, this exhibition really couldn't have happened without the two of you. would you share with us the story of your collaboration? How did you two get to know each other? When did you first meet? How did you become the driving forces behind this Sophie Taeuber-Arp retrospective?
And would you like to? Yeah. No, go on.
Oh, I thought you would go first. I am imagining we each have different stories to tell, but
We met in person, I think, 2006 in New York during the Dada exhibition. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's fair. I can back it up a little bit to say that one of my great mentors at MoMA was a curator named Carolyn Lanchner, who did the first and to date only Sophie Taeuber-Arp retrospective in the United States in 1981. And so from the moment I was sort of a baby curator working as Carolyn's assistant, I heard from her about what an amazing, underrated artist Sophie Taeuber-Arp was. And as a graduate student, in fact, Walburga was when I first met Walburga via correspondence when she was at the Arp Stiftung, because she was an incredibly gracious resource for young art historians writing. And I was really interested in the Gallery Gumans, which was designed by Sophie Taeuber-Arp. So we'd been corresponding, but then as Walburga said, I had the first chance to meet you in person in 2006 at the time of the Dada, Big Dada exhibition at MoMA, organized by the Pompidou and the National Gallery, and that traveled to New York in the summer of 2006. And I just remember there were a number of works by Sophie Taeuber-Arp in that show, but that really only covered the early years in Zurich from 1916 to 1920. And just, that was amazing to see all of those together. But it was also when Walburga and I began to talk about how that was just the beginning of a career, that then went on for 2 more decades and grew to encompass, as we've all been saying, architecture and design and fine arts and furniture and pedagogy and all the rest. So fast forward, where are we? 2020? No, we're 2021. So every project, I don't know, that we undertook took this long. Like I can't think of another, in fact, that I've dreamed about for so long. And so we were so grateful when Eva and Natalia and the Tate and Kunstmuseum Basel wanted to join forces and make this into a real transatlantic, big international event.
So basically you reached out to Walburga and said, hey, are we going to, can we bring you on board as an expert, or how does this work?
Oh, how does that work? Well, let's see. It always was rather, I think when Walburga and I first started talking about it, you were at the Stiftung, right? And then I just knew from speaking with you, yes, that I didn't want to do a Taeuber-Arp show without Walburga's expertise. There's no one, to my knowledge, who has studied the artist for as long or as in depth as her. And so I think we always, in my mind, I always thought of it as Walburga and I would do this in partnership. And so when it finally was proposed at MoMA and got on the schedule, it was very much with, she knew, I mean, we talked about it. You looked at my slideshow for the presentation to the exhibition committee, right? Yeah.
She's always just a phone call away. That's just amazing. With like any question I had, be it specific or broad, it was just incredible that Walburga could answer it all. I guess for us it's very satisfying here in Switzerland that Sophie Taeuber-Arp, who is of course a Swiss artist, and was present on the 50 franc note, which I'm going to show you here. This is the 50 franc note, so they are former banknotes. They are not in use anymore, but still there you can actually see how important she is to Switzerland, right? And also is it fair to say that she was exhibited widely in the German-speaking countries? I mean, there's, I feel, at least some name recognition here. But Natalia, I was wondering, actually, how is the situation in London? Will people actually recognize the name Sophie Taeuber-Arp when you're going to open your show in summer?
Thank you so much, Eva. As we are telling stories, I wanted to share one with you as well. And mine started a bit earlier. Mine started in 1997 when Walburga took the Sophie Taeuber-Arp and Arp exhibition to the State Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And me being a student, still undergraduate student, I took a train from Moscow to St. Petersburg to look at the works. And that was my very first encounter with Sophie Taeuber-Arp and with Walburga as expert and curator. So it gives me, I actually have behind me, I've got a catalogue. Walburga, next time we see each other in the real life, I hope you'll sign it for me. So it gives me incredible pleasure to be here today and to be part of this amazing, groundbreaking research project, exhibition project, and it means a lot for the institution, Tate Modern as an institution, and for our public in the UK to be able to see the depth and breadth of Sophie Taeuber's studio practice for the very first time in London. Unlike Germany, France, of course, Switzerland, or the US, in the UK, we have just a handful of works by Sophie Taeuber-Arp in the public collections. And although our visitors or avid museum goers might be familiar with her work, going to large-scale group exhibitions such as Modernist Couples or Into the Night, the Art and the Cabaret, but to see her work from the very first work she created to the very last drawings she created just a few weeks before she tragically passed away is the first opportunity for our public. So we are feeling very, very privileged to be a part of this incredible project.
But isn't this just incredible? I mean, I've had people approach me during the opening and basically just asking, what you said during the press conference, is that really true? Is this the first international appearance of Sophie Taeuber-Arp in that truly international scope with MoMA and Tate? And they were just incredulous. And I have to admit, I kind of like share their incredulity because, I mean, what do you think, Anne and Natalia, has changed? And since you started thinking about the exhibition in 2006, I remember you telling me that you had thought of bringing it on the calendar way earlier, and that there was some resistance. What changed actually?
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure it's more complicated than simple resistance. But there was at the beginning a number of people would say to me, oh, well, but isn't it more interesting to show Taeuber-Arp with her husband? And that was not interesting to me at all, because I felt that there had been a number of shows, although you could say not in the United States, that looked at the collaboration or the couple or the duo. So I think it took a while to advocate for a show centered, not as though Sophie Taeuber-Arp didn't collaborate, and not that her relationship with Hans Arp wasn't very important and generative and all the rest, but just that the show I'd imagined was very much shining a light on her. And I think, so what changed? A lot changed, I suppose. You know, in the United States, the Me Too movement is huge. I think the awareness ever more urgent, after this past year, about how inadequate our received histories is something that is being addressed in like more serious ways. And I think also MoMA too, over those years, was really rethinking how we present our collections. So these are all tied together. So recently in 2019, the Museum of Modern Art opened a new presentation of its the museum's collection that for the first time was interdisciplinary. All of the different departments, architecture, design, photo, drawings, prints, media, performance, painting, and sculpture shown together synoptically. And suddenly when you begin to look at art history in that way as interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, and you're thinking about how many people, figures of importance, have been just overlooked, whether due to gender or race or nationality, all of a sudden, Sophie Taeuber-Arp's career begins to feel like so of the moment and so timely and so urgent. And so I think, it's hard to pin it to any one thing, but I think the sort of world changed around, and suddenly over 17 years.
Suddenly after 17 years, the time was ripe.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not fair, because originally it was going to be on the calendar for 2018. I mean, I'm sure at both Tate and Basel, or maybe you can correct me, things change on the schedule a lot. And I know when Basel and London joined in, we agreed to postpone the show by 2 more years, which I thought was fabulous. More time to write the catalog and do the research. And then the pandemic for MoMA postponed it by yet another year. So who would have known? That's what made it 17.
Yeah, I think actually what I greatly enjoy about the show is that it's really as comprehensive as it can get. Like, we are really trying to show not just Sophie Taeuber-Arp as an abstract artist in Paris, which some other shows have focused on, but also give equal attention to this incredibly beautiful early work as an applied artist when she's still based in Zurich. But again, when I spoke to people during the opening, I got some reactions like, this is difficult to reconcile. And the way we installed it also, it's in chronological order, obviously, but you almost get like these 2 parts in the show, right? First section, applied art, second section is abstract art. And it may look as if there's not so much in between, but I think there are subtle ways of connecting these 2 worlds, and I'd just be really curious to know how you think about these 2 worlds in Sophie Taeuber-Arp's oeuvre and how they relate. And would you like to start, and then we just march through and ask Natalia afterwards?
Yeah, okay, no, sure. I just don't want to, I can talk for hours about Sophie Taeuber-Arp, and I don't want to monopolize. So I think that's to say, if the question is it wrong to put applied arts and fine arts and architecture all on the same footing? Is that a distortion in some way? I would argue that is sort of a hierarchical way of thinking that Sophie Taeuber-Arp's oeuvre, taken as a whole, undoes. And I think back, personally, when I got to see, this will sound like a digression, but at the Tate, they had this amazing Annie Albers show that focused around her weaving. And I was fortunate enough to go on a tour, a walkthrough with Briony Fair, who's one of the catalog authors for Sophie Taeuber-Arp and who had co-organized the Annie Albers exhibition. And it's relevant, and in fact, Ava, with the images that you have up on the screen now, these beautiful early pencil abstractions, which are most likely began life as applied arts exercises for textile design or for color experimentation, and that were not shown in a fine art context until much later. And I think what Briody, I believe, would say, looking at these, are looking at comparable things by Annie Albers that were textile studies that began life that way, but now can be seen as forerunners of very radical, non-objective abstract art, would say, but you don't have to choose. Like, the beauty is, these can be both textile studies,
yeah,
and they can have applied arts connections. And today, with our 21st century eyes, we can see them as pioneering abstractions. And that idea of a both and as opposed to an either or art history is what I think Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work in its totality argues for. And that she herself, as we know too, by the 1930s, was revisiting not necessarily these works, but works from this time and repositioning them within an abstract art context. So I'm sure Walburga and Natalia, or you've all thought about this a lot. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Natalia,
Absolutely.
will you go
Yes. Thank you so much for mentioning Annie Albers. There was a wonderful exhibition curated by Anne Coxon, a colleague of mine. And indeed, the success of this exhibition was, for us as a museum, completely unexpected. And that just showed that the public doesn't see this divide as clearly as curators or art historians or a subject specialist. During the last 20 years, during the first quarter of the 21st century, the visual culture and the visual world in which people lived undergone incredible change. And it's the very polymathic nature of Sophie Taeuber's work which appeals to the public. And it also appeals to the new, younger generation of artists who now makes their way into our gallery, both at MoMA, at Tate Modern. In Tate Modern, we have room after room after room of works which belong to, if we come to it from a very kind of structured point of view, into different categories: applied art, textiles art, sound art, photography, sculpture, installation. So for our audiences, it would not come as a surprise. Just to give you one example, she's absolutely incredibly inspirational for a young generation of artists who started their practice in the 21st century and now look back to acknowledge the role of artists like Sophie Taeuber-Arp, who were the first to push those boundaries and loosen up those very strict borders between the disciplines and between the mediums. Just one example, Hege Young, we just had her monographic exhibition at Tate, St. Ives. I believe there was one display of her work at MoMA very recently as well. She is singing about Sophie Taeuber-Arp at every opportunity. She always states and highlights how inspirational her work was for her. And she uses the forms and shapes and approaches Sophie Arp developed in her career, in her own work. So I very much doubt that anyone will be surprised to see both applied art works, reliefs, furniture, and works of graphic art and paintings in the same space. I think our public is totally ready for that.
Walburga, could I ask you to tell us more about the history actually of this work? Because for me, we put it in the first room and it's just beautiful there. but you told me how it began its life actually as something different, not as this modernist triptych, right?
So yes, new research from a restorer said, well, we have the first information about this painting, this so-called triptych from 1918, which is really exceptional because Sophie Taeuber-Arp at that time did not set such huge paintings. So it was always for me a question mark. What is that? And then I found, that the co-editor of the Catalogue Raisonné of Sophie Taeuber-Arp, published in 1948, was Hugo Weber, an artist from Basel, who worked in Clamart with Arp on the Catalogue Raisonné. And he had small, tiny files, and he wrote in parentheses for this work, paravent.
Okay.
And if you look at it, it really could be a 3-part paravent, but it was maybe not huge enough, sir. And Arp donated it in 1958 to the Kunsthaus Zurich. And now they started, just before the opening of the new building, a research and an examination of the work. And they saw that it has been cut so that it was larger before. And I think the first time that it was transferred from a paravent into a painting was maybe in 1939, when 2 parts of it have been exhibited in Paris at an exhibition about abstract art in the 1920s.
But that was actually Sophie Taeuber-Arp's decision herself, right? She basically took a former work of applied art and decided, oh, I'm going to put 2 of these panels on a wall, and now it's abstract art.
Right.
Yes, because at that time they made it an exhibition in 2 parts. One part was abstraction before 1920, and the other part was abstraction after 1920. And in the before 1920 parts, she had only in parentheses applied arts, if you want, like so. And so they didn't accept her. And then she transformed this painting, this paravent, into a 2-part painting. But it doesn't work. She was in the second part of the after 20s abstraction.
But I think that is such a great story, which basically speaks to the heart of our exhibition. And this question, some people ask whether we are turning something into art that's not supposed to be art because it's just applied art. Mm-hmm. And as Anne and Natalia also mentioned, these things are changing rapidly. And I think we as art historians are noting more and more that it's on us to change our language and not on the artists to change their work. And there are many instances also like this one that you just described during Sophie Taeuber-Arp's lifetime, that she had a very flexible and constantly changing view of her own work. And who are we to basically try and put it into boxes, right? And also how she exhibited works of applied art in the fine art context early on in 1918 here in Basel. I think that's actually one of the most inspirational aspects of our entire show, how we are trying to transgress these boundaries as the artists did over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. I think that the exhibition Das Neue Leben in Basel in 1918, that was a first attempt to bring all the art together, to have a synthesis of the arts, you see. Yeah. Very modern at that time. And if we are still thinking, or people asking, why do you bring these things to art? It's an old-fashioned way of thinking. There are still the borders, you see.
Yeah.
And
I think it's, sorry. I just was going to say, I think it's part of what makes it living, to look at the title of the show, is when something's identity is always ready for a new look. It keeps art alive in that way.
That's very true. Yeah. And it's a very satisfying feeling to be a motor of that sort of change also, if I can be so frank. What I think is this retrospective actually offers this sort of entire view of Sophie Taeuber-Arp's oeuvre, and we are putting her Dadaist works up, and as well her works from the Paris avant-garde. And she basically, with her life and oeuvre, spans these two major art movements of the early 20th century, right? That in itself is basically incredible, like this sort of Zurich hub and then the Paris years. But Anne, I was thinking, what is your take on Sophie Taeuber-Arp in these two artists' movements? Was she as much a Dadaist as she was a member of Cercle et Carré and Abstraction Création? Or would you say there is a sort of difference in involvement on her part?
Oh, I think Walburga probably better than I can speak to the absolute specifics of things, but I think for me it's just important to note that in both cases she was a participant. She was in the room, and I think that in each case the groups, whether the Dadaists in Zurich in the immediate aftermath of World War I, or with the abstract artist groups in Paris, you know, these are, she'd found an audience of sorts in both cases, and both were groups involved with cultural and political questions about the role of art. I mean, with the Dadaists, about the meaning of anything in a way. And I think the fact, so here we're looking at two of her amazing marionettes for the puppet play King Stag, right? And that was performed in Zurich, first performed in Zurich in 1918. That was really the moment when Taeuber-Arp was, I believe, Walburga will correct me as always if I get this all wrong, but when Walburga was really recognized for the first time by the Dadaists or by someone like Tristan Tzara, say, as an artist in her own right, not just an applied arts teacher, not just a performer or dancer, but as a real creative force. And that from this moment on, I think 1918 is also, as you noted, Eva, the year of the first Das Neue Leben show in Basel, right? So that it's the beginning of a different sort of awareness for Taeuber-Arp of herself, straddling applied arts, fine arts, creating works like these that can be performed with always with those same essential geometric shapes and abstract vocabulary, which I'll digress and just say I, as you know, can't wait to see the show, but I know just looking at the book, I get such a sense of this fundamental vocabulary that she's then able to transform, right, for her different purposes. But that's going offline. Your question was about Dada and Cercle et Carré. So I think the fact that she then in 1920, I don't know if you have them in here, she makes those little, like here on the left, is one of her so-called Dada heads. Although this work we now know was very likely first shown in one of the Das Neue Leben exhibitions under the title Study for a Marionette, with a subtitle Portrait of H.A. And who else could H.A. really be but Hans Arp, her husband? So creating these turned wood objects that are, you can't really tell, right, with the work on the left. Is it a study for a marionette? Is it a portrait bust? Is it an abstract sculpture? Is it a mask? Like already beginning that kind of, you know, defying easy categorizability. Early on, you see that there. But then in 1920, anyway, I'll wrap up, right? Then she makes two works, another Dada head and a Dada head flat, where she inscribes the word Dada and she writes the date 1920. And I think to me, that's so significant that she's writing herself into the history of that movement in that way on her artworks. And I suppose you can't quite say the same thing for, yeah, there. And then she poses right on the left with that 1920 Dada head behind it. in that same hat, it looks like on the Swiss banknote, right? That's funny.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, it made me wonder when you showed me the Swiss banknote, like who chose that photograph for the banknote? It's just out of all the pictures too. Anyway, okay, that's really off track. Anyway, here she goes to a professional photographer and she sort of immortalizes herself. But of course, with Taeuber-Arp, it's always sort of a game, right? She's half hiding, half hidden. She's using a veil to mask her face, and she puts the object right in front of her, but as a way of writing herself into a history of which Dada is a part and an important part, and in all her biographies listings subsequently, she would note Dada as part of her history. And I don't remember if she does the same for Cercle Carré and Abstraction, Création. Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if that answered it.
But Walburga, could I follow up with a question, since we are looking at this fantastic photo where Sophie Taeuber-Arp is dancing? Actually, one of my first, what I recall from one of our first conversations actually was how you, with great intensity, explained to me that Sophie Taeuber-Arp, yes, she was a pupil at Rudolf von Laban's dance school in Zurich. And yes, she danced in 1917 at the opening of the Dada gallery, but that we have very little evidence of her actually being a dancer, and that the reception of her as a dancer was way overblown. And you had developed a sort of fervor, I would say, with that topic. And I would love could you just elaborate on that subject and how the reception of this phase in her life is so off, and maybe also speculate a little for us why it may be so appealing to the audiences and art historians alike?
Well, I think she is, for me, she is not only the dancer, like we can see her, the dancer performing at the opening of the Galerie Dada, or performing with the Laban school, which is something different. We have to see that the Laban school and Dada was officially not connected. There have been some pupils from Laban, like Sophie Taeuber-Arp was one, being related to some Dadaists. Sophie Taeuber-Arp is Hans Arp, she was the first one. And then later on, Hans Richter, for example, was related to one of the the Laban school dancers. And so it came that the Laban school dancers privately performed with them, as private person performed with Dadaists in the Galerie Dada, or even some of them before already at the Cabaret Voltaire, but not Sophie Taeuber. But for me, it's quite interesting to see her as well before in Munich as a dancer on the so-called Fasching Ball. And she loved that from the very beginning when she came in 1910 and went to the first Fasching Ball in Munich. And she is fascinated by that. She is staying there until early in the morning, creating her own costumes. And what is very inspiring for her, and what we can find in the correspondence, is that Munich at that time was a center of modern dance as well. And she went to see, for example, Clotilde d'Erb, and she saw Sainte-Ma Ahesa, and she was very impressed to see this dancer, to see the bodies of the dancers, how they moved. And then we have here the photo of Sophie Taeuber-Arp in 1914 at one of her last Fasching balls in Munich with a costume she created by herself. And then when she came to Zurich in 1915, she was looking for, at the very beginning, before she came to Laban, for something. She started before in Germany with Mensendiek gymnastic. I think the intention was in Zurich to find something similar. And so when she saw the Laban school, that it opened in 1915, she went there to take lessons and created her own dances, as we know from Katja Wulff, but performed mainly with the Laban school, with the troupe and even single dancers. And I think she was part of the department for costumes and scenography for the Laban school. And that was in a way in my eyes, a preparation for the marionettes. That when she built the marionettes, when you have a look at the marionettes again and see them, that they are not covered by clothes, they are naked in a way, with just only a few accessoires, and that you can see the mechanical way how they moved, and that they can really move in extreme directions. And that is really something that fascinated her from the very beginning in Munich. And
all right, so your answer is a little bit, it goes in two directions, basically. You're saying that, yes, there was a strong involvement starting already in Munich, and yes, she tried to basically nurture that interest in her Zurich years when she had to return there due to the outbreak of the First World War. But no, we do not have evidence of her dancing frequently in Dadaist circles, and
no,
basically everything else depends on our imagination of how we relate her later work to this sort of choreographic thinking and bodies in movement.
No, we know only from the one performance at the opening of the Gallery Dada,
yeah.
And that because of Hugo Ball made a note in his diary. And at the end of 1970, he published in a newspaper another description of this dance in different words. You see, that are the only two. And Sarah is giving in his chronic of the time in Zurich one sentence to the performance by Sophie Taeuber-Arp, but that is all we have, you see. And we have this photo. And to be honest, we have to say that we always say it is Sophie Taeuber-Arp,
but we don't really know.
Yes, because the person behind the costume and mask is, you can't see, is it a man, is it a woman? It's
it's the role.
Actually, this is a point where I'd like to just stay for hours and make people aware of how widely diverging the reception of Sophie Taeuber-Arp as a dancer and the actual proof of her ever dancing is. But I think we do have another we do have more ground to cover. Or Anne, just looking at you right now, it seems there's something on the tip of your tongue that you want to share.
Always on the tip of my tongue. I just was going to say that for me, it's useful listening to Walburga talk to think about Sophie Taeuber-Arp at that moment as she is involved with Laban and she's involved with Dada. And it's just like it's the same. She's involved as an applied arts teacher and she's involved with Dada. It's just always being aware of the kind of complexity of her as a creative personality, like that even Dada is a pigeonhole category that we need to complicate, and which Walburga spoke to. So I'm done with what was
Natalia, could I ask you how your sorry, I need to look for this slide basically where we have Sophie Taeuber-Arp in her costumes again, because I wanted to ask you about your involvement with women artists of the avant-garde, and I think you're incredibly interested in their use of textiles, right? And I'm just curious to hear how having this sort of broader context may have changed your perception of Sophie Taeuber-Arp creating these costumes and dance and use textiles.
Absolutely. Before embarking on this incredible journey with you and Walburga and Anne, I've worked on Natalia Gontrova exhibition. And I should say Natalia Gontrova was also one of those artists who, for the very first time, looked at her creative practice very holistically and realized that it's not only just painting, it's absolutely everything she did as a creative force that mattered. Just before the outbreak of the First World War, she had a huge monographic exhibition. Imagine 32 years old artist, female, in Russia, very conservative country at the time, having been the first avant-garde artist, first new generation artist to represent her peers with the first ever monographic exhibition of contemporary art in Russia. And what she shows absolutely everything. She brings everything out of her studio and puts it on display. There are over 800 works on the checklist for that exhibition. Well, we're not sure she actually managed to put them all on display, but it just gives you an idea. And amongst this body of work were her designs for the costumes she did. She worked with the theatre, and also she worked with classical theatre at the time, trying to reconcile the Baroque plays with the very new and imaginative visual culture of the early avant-garde, and also her costume designs. She was talent hunted by one of the most coveted couturier who served the imperial court, Nadezhda Lamakina, to create the designs for embroideries and applique for women in the high society. So this is what was happening. Women were breaking those boundaries. They were putting things on displays, and they were saying, "Look, please do not compartmentalize me. Do not create those pigeonholes. Whatever we do, whatever the creative output of our studio is, it's art." And Sophie Taeuber-Arp had very similar, very brave approach, saying, "This is what I do. And this is part of my creativity, and it's all me, and it's all art."
I think that's a wonderful way of contextualizing Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work with someone that is actually geographically not related, but where you get a feeling of how these things have been in the air, basically, right? And that there are other examples in which Sophie Taeuber-Arp's works will be inscribed in a way. And I think the whole question of how versatile her art is, working with textile, dance, wood, all sorts of materials that are frankly very challenging to put on in an exhibition. We've never actually worked with glass windows in the modern context before, at least I haven't. Or bring in beaded bags. And in Sophie Taeuber-Arp's oeuvre, you find all these different materials and textures, and basically you have to bring in specialized conservators if you don't have them already, like MoMA has.
We don't have textile conservators or beaded bag conservators either. So.
You don't? Well, that's a position you should have.
I wish.
So how do you think, with this sort of versatility, has this also been something that made it more difficult for people to actually deal with her, because she's so difficult to put in a box? And for a while, I think art historians were really, really fond of their categories and boxes. Is this something that complicated reception history of Sophie Taeuber-Arp, or what do you think, Walburga?
Maybe for art historians, but not for the audience, I think. For the audience, I think it's what Natalia said, but for the art history, yes. I remember that in 1948, Hans Arp, Sophie Taeuber-Arp died in 1943. Arp wrote a letter to Hans Richter, because at that time in Paris, Michel Zefort is working on the exhibition on the Maître d'Art Abstrait, and it's at the point who is the first abstract artists, are the important artists. And Arp is, yes, but he wanted to work for Sophie Taeuber-Arp. And for the early years, he has the same problem like at the exhibition in 1939. He has the supplied artworks only. So Richter, who was writing at that time an essay on the marionettes, Arp asked him to write that there's a photo. Richter wanted to reproduce a photo of the scenography in the palace of the King's Stag scene. That is the first abstract painting Sophie Taeuber-Arp did in 1918, so that she is really at a very early time.
All right, so it's basically this moment where you have this sort of competition, who got there first, who was the first.
Yes, and that the art historians accept only, let's say, painting, that they still have the categories in their mind, you see, and therefore beaded bags are not art for them.
Right. Isn't Lynn Cook doing a big show now about abstraction and textiles, I've heard, right? So like there are all these things that were kept separate in the past by art historians that now, once you start opening the discourse and the questions up, so the connections are all over the place. But I think previously, to your question, Ava, like one of the things that kept Taeuber-Arp out of the art history books was the very thing that we love the most about her now, which is her uncategorizability according to conventional notions of painting, sculpture, design, all that. And all these wonderful materials that you see here. This, for example, is Sophie Taeuber-Arp also being an architect. Here she basically built her own house in Clamart. And now that we've spoken at length about her early work and textiles and dance and costumes, I think we should, towards the end of our talk, take a closer look at Sophie Taeuber-Arp as an abstract artist in Paris. And hearing abstract art, I still get a feeling that many people still think immediately about someone like the Dutch artist Piet Mondrian, or Kazimir Malevich, for example. But interestingly, and that I find really thrilling, is that hers is not an abstraction that is derived from nature. And it's also neither an abstraction that's quasi-religious, as you could maybe label Mondrian and Malevich. So what is her special brand of abstraction for Sophie Taeuber-Arp? Anyone who wants to dare make a statement? What makes her abstraction Sophie Taeuber-Arp? I think Walburga, says in her essay in the catalog something that I found useful about thinking of Sophie Taeuber-Arp's abstraction, which is that her fundamental insight was that she could use the orthogonal structure of the woven support as the basis, not just for weaving or not just for beaded bags, but ultimately for architectural spaces or for works on canvas, but that its origins, as you're saying, Ava, in a different way from Mondrian, for Kandinsky, right, don't originate in a reductive approach from nature, but from starting from a completely different foundation, which in this case is that grid, the orthogonal grid, but of a real world textured utilitarian fabric that then also, right, could provide the supporter structure for an abstraction, and to fall back on our title of a living animated sort. And here, even in this beautiful Equilibre, is that this is Equilibrium, 1932. Even here, right, in that wonderful slanted way, you have that cross and lines.
I guess the starting point is the grid of the Stramin in the textiles, or let's say in the oil painting the canvas. It's the same, in a way, the same ground on which she is working.
Mm-hmm. I'm always struck by how works like these or these stacks here they almost, well, they're never really symmetrical. They are stable,
Yes.
unstable.
Yes.
And this is, for me, basically the core of her work, that she strives for a sort of balance without ever using the simple means of just making it symmetrical.
Yes.
It's like this incredible sensitivity for color, for balance, for weight, and you get a simple, elegant, striking work like this one.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, the art historian Yves Lambois wrote of the constant play in Taeuber-Arp's work between regularity and irregularity, to speak to what you're saying, Eva, because, right, of course, it's never just the symmetry of the grid, or a repetition of a form, or a perfect division. Like even here, where she is repeating related shapes, every one of them is different. And somehow I think it's just miraculous, right, that she introduces a sense of precariousness and movement into what could so easily be an inert symmetrical composition.
And I just love how she divides the background into two types of blue.
Mm-hmm.
It's never what you think, right? It's like with some of these colored circles, you look at an image and you say, oh, okay, so these circles are red and blue and there's one white. And then you stand in front of the picture and you see there are all sorts of reds and blues and greens. And it's just so differentiated that it's like you need the actual confrontation with the work to become aware of it. It just doesn't work on reproductions. So please come all to our show.
Absolutely.
Anyway, Natalia, anything to add, or shall we, with a look at the watch, move on? What are your thoughts?
I think it's very difficult to add something to Walburga's and Anne's remarks, and you have, I know, quite a lot planned for us. So let's move on, or open the floor to our public.
No, not yet. We have still a few questions to get to.
Wonderful.
No, just let me ask you about Sophie Taeuber-Arp and Hans Arp, because we already established that, this was something where they even collaborated, right? And that's a point that I find really interesting, because you won't find a certain kind of works in the exhibition. And I wanted Anne and Walburga to briefly elaborate why you made this decision to exclude the collaborative works, and also just speak a little bit about Hans Arp being, after her early and accidental death in 1943, someone who helped compile the catalog Raisonné, and how that is actually something that became a book to which I at least have developed a sort of love-hate relationship, because it basically is at the source of what makes dealing with Sophie Taeuber-Arp's oeuvre difficult. Walburga, could you speak to these two aspects?
To me, it was important, as we started at the beginning, to make really a Sophie Taeuber-Arp exhibition and not Sophie Taeuber-Arp and Hans Arp, and that over the years, we found that not all works that have been said by Hans Arp to be so-called duo works or Gemeinschaftsarbeiten are really duo works. You see, when Sophie Taeuber-Arp died, it was for Arp in a way like a part of his life died as well, I think. She was immensely important for him, not only as his wife, but she was a collaborator, and they worked together on they really worked in the 30s together on each one on his art, but working together, living for the first time together in a house with two ateliers. situation in Zurich before was more difficult. And she was so far a collaborator for Arp, as she did, for example, she made plans for his wooden sculptures. So that was a part that he couldn't do. So she made the plans for the carpenters, for example, or she sometimes repainted reliefs for Arp. And when she died, so it was really a break for Arp. And he started to work first on a memory book, collecting texts by friends, but by the time he decided to make a catalogue raisonné, and then it became the book, which was published in 1948. And we all say, oh my God, only a small part of applied arts works in that catalogue. But that was not due to Arp. Arp wanted to have these works in the catalogue raisonné. He was, we just have to keep in mind that they met in 1915 in the Gallery Tanner, where he was exhibiting textiles. So for Arp, it was never the question of applied and free arts. For him, these borders didn't exist. So he wanted to have these works in the catalogue raisonné, but it was her sister who worked with Arp on the catalogue raisonné who said, there are so many works, but they have been sold and I don't know where. So if we only bring in the catalogue the few works I have in my collection, it's not representative. So they decided not to make an applied arts section. They did a very small one, but we have, for example, the marionettes are not in the catalogue raisonné. It's a funny thing because they have been in the Museum für Gestaltung at that time. The museum bought them very early. And later on, Arp began to make what later in 1988, Sander Kutti at the Kunstmuseum Bern, when he made the duo exhibition Hans Arp, SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP, he called it recreation. That Arp started maybe in the early 50s, we don't know it exactly, to use a small drawing by SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP and to make huge reliefs, and exhibiting it as a work by SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP. And not only reliefs, there are as well paintings. And so there is a group of works, so-called, some recreations, some are shown as duo works, so that it was for me clear, I just wanted to show only SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP because there's more research needed. Yeah.
Is this something where you would say that our catalog now will be the new standard work, basically the reference work, where if you want to find SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP, you're going to find it there?
Yes.
Well, it's a beginning, right? What you really need is a new catalog raisonné that's comprehensive.
That's the other point. Yes, absolutely.
I think, and I think if I might, the only thing I would add to what Walburga said, and I too, I'm looking at your clock ticking there, is that with any show, you just cannot include everything. But what we did know that we wanted to include was SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP as an applied artist, as an architect designer, and as a fine artist. All three, and that we didn't, to echo Walburga, we did steer away from works that were posthumously identified by Arp as duo works, and by works that were posthumously recreated by Arp, which isn't to say that had SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP been alive, she might not have been fine with it. I mean, Arp was recreating his Dada year works in the 50s. Marcel Duchamp was, Man Ray. There's a whole context in which that happened. The difference was SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP wasn't alive to say, I like those materials. I like that paint color. I think that's the right size. So we did, want to try as best we could to let the story of SOPHIE TAEUBER-ARP's work be told with the works that she herself designated as works of art during her lifetime, and to see what that would say. And to that extent, that's what is laid out in the book.
I think it's going to be an incredibly useful resource for everyone who's interested in her art. It's just so rich in research, and really the research that you two have done for years is will be there for generations, I think, and that's something that's just so important to have this sort of milestone in this book. I'd like to take the last few minutes. We have another 5 to 7.5 minutes, I guess, to remind everyone that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we have achieved the impossible and ignored that fact for almost an hour now. So now, towards the end of this talk, I think we should return to the fact that this exhibition should have opened a year ago, or not a year ago, but in fall at MoMA, and only due to the pandemic, it became, it had its first venue here in Basel, because MoMA decided to postpone for another year. For me, especially during the spring last year, it was incredibly important to have this show to work on. It really gave me stability in the midst of a very volatile situation. I can imagine that you probably felt the same. But what also changed was that I felt that I looked at Sophie Taeuber-Arp's work differently due to the situation. Is this something that you experienced also? Or do you think your exhibitions or your research or your way of thinking about Sophie Taeuber-Arp would have been exactly the same during any other year?
Well, I'll talk quickly. I'll say, well, I was really grateful to have our community in our Zooms and our project. And I've thought all along it's a miracle that it has kept going and is realized. And did it change? It certainly made me think more about those last years of her life, living in exile in Graz and continuing to create works of art. And I've always been drawn to them, but they took on sort of, while we were all quarantining and not being able to go where we wanted to go. I responded to that part of the arc of her story differently, since I still haven't gotten to see all the works in person together. I can't really.
I can't wait to have you here, all of you.
But I don't know, Walburga and Natalia, it's a great question.
Yes, it's the quarantine and the pandemic made situation much more personal. Her finding herself at the end of her life in her own country as a migrant. She didn't have. She only had equivalent of a tourist visa to go back to Zurich and spend time with her family. She couldn't go back to where she established her home. They decided not to go across the Atlantic and start a new life in the US. And me being stuck on an island, not being able to see my own family for a year and a half, just makes it that much closer and that much more poignant, and understanding, helps to understand what kind of emotional state she was at the very end of her life, and a look at her late works in a different light. And when you talked, Walburga, about her and Arp, and how the works she created then were reconstructed in different materials, I'm also thinking about the very last dramatic design she did with ink, which in the 50s Arp created into reliefs, and thinking, what would she feel? Because those were works created in a particular state of mind and emotion, and all of a sudden they're shiny and in metal and in totally different materials and in a different context. So yes, the pandemic helped to magnify certain parts of her career and her life in a very different way.
I think for me, it just drove home the point that in 1918, her exhibition of, or her use of the marionettes was cut short due to a Spanish flu pandemic, and that she lived through the First World War and only had some friends and found her husband due to the war because he had fled Strasbourg, and how she lived through the world economic crisis and then became a refugee during the Second World War, and how basically her entire life is in constant crisis mode, and that we are living in a time of a pandemic, and we are working with a sort of oeuvre by this artist who was in constant crisis basically, and kept on working, and created the most beautiful life-affirming art that is basically available to everyone in a visual language that is understandable by everybody, because that's what they thought about abstraction, right? That it's not elitist, it's very approachable. Everybody can understand it. And I think these aspects were just something that in this sort of intensity, I probably wouldn't have worked with in any other year. I don't know, Walburga, but what did it influence your way of thinking?
I have always in mind, you see, in 1938, the situation in France, not only in France, in Germany, and there are many refugees in France, and the art market is very bad. So it's a situation for artists is not very good, but she's right. And Hans Arp is at that time a little bit depressed about what's going on, about the Nazis in Germany and everything. And she wrote to her sister that she always has ideas, even she could make money with it, but she always has ideas, you see, and that is very positive for me. And when I read the letters from the time in Grasse, where she is a refugee, and when I see the drawings, the colored drawings in Grasse, then I see a person which is very optimistic. And in Grasse, she is happy, she loves it's both. You see, the situation is very bad, and the letters are full of that they have no food and all the things all other people have as well. But she loves the country. She's really happy there. That is something that astonished me. So that I don't. For me, the last works are not, or the thing what I have before my eyes when I see Sophie Taeuber-Arp are not this black and white ink drawings. I think this is just something she did for Chisholm, but that is not the image which is remaining when I see Sophie Taeuber-Arp. The last letter in our book is one she is sending to her niece, and she is telling it in December about what she is doing in the house, and there's just a baby born, her first grandniece. It's very positive. So I think even if there have been crises, it's like the word heureuse, which will remain, that there is a very positive power in her.
I think this is such a perfect conclusion to this talk. And we've basically come full circle with alluding back to the beautiful quote that Daniel read us in the beginning. If all of you are in agreement, I'd like to now open the floor to the public. If they are interested to jump in with questions, keep in mind that you can actually participate. We are done talking for the moment. Incredible but true.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Eva. I'll take the role to refer to one question that has arrived. And it was, it's maybe a good starting point. The question is, where is the exhibition and Umland just mentioned a while ago, that is, Abstraction and Textile taking place. So this and was obviously your reference to a project by Lynn Cook, but I think it's an interesting question in terms of maybe also the index to a larger issue, meaning textile politics within the visual arts, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I can try. I don't know if I can talk about textual politics within the visual arts. I can talk anyway. In answer to the audience members' question, this exhibition I referred to, I believe, was planned for the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. This was pre-pandemic, so I may have been out of turn and even referencing it. But to Daniel's point, I do think it is just a sign of the shift in how we think about origin stories with art history, and that it's not the passing of a baton from one famous white male artist working autonomously in a studio that produced is it's the word model for artistic production, but that abstraction's origins are much more open-ended and imbricated in the fabric, no pun intended, of everyday life. And there have been all sorts of new theoretical books written that, my goodness, I have them on my reading list. I haven't delved into any of them. Julia Bryant Wilson and others writing about weaving, fabric, textiles, and art, and how things that have been separated previously are now being looked at together.
Thank you very much. We haven't had more questions, but this is understandable given the incredible richness of and detailed stories you added in the last hour or so. So allow me to ask one first question. Please, the public, use again the F&A, that's the German version, or the Q&A bottom in the menu. If you want to add a question, we'll be very happy to try to answer it.
Actually, there's one that just came in, Daniel.
Oh, great.
Yeah, about the socio-historic context of her work, and at least how it compares to her male colleagues, and how did she maybe see the world? What did it do to her? Can we recognize certain things in her work? Would you agree, and do you have an answer to why it is this way? Is there anyone who feels that he can respond there?
Well, in a word, yes, of course, the socio-historic context is as worthy of investigation as her gender and her applied arts background and her fine arts background. But I think your question is more profound than that, and I'm not sure I'm equipped.
But would it be fair to say that it is astonishing that she actually lived through all these crises and we see so few of them in her work? Because I mean, there are other artists in the same sort of socioeconomic context that respond with, I would say, a criticism of a social status or poverty, or in a very direct way. And her work and her abstraction in particular is something that's like floating above all these things, and where you can't basically draw a relation to specific events. Is that fair?
You mean a mimetic relationship? You can't draw a mimetic. You can't say this represents a political protest. Is that what you're?
Well, not even in the sense that you would say it gets darker or the mood gets darker or something.
But that's still representational, the way you're describing it, right? Darker is a visual. I mean, I don't mean to. I'm always interested.
I think it's hugely interesting to me how her work develops in parallel of these really dire circumstances, and how she sticks to her visual language, and that it is a political statement in a way, but it's not an obvious one, because just being an abstract artist at the time is a political statement, right? You can't not be political if you are an abstract artist, because since the early 30s, abstraction was by the dictatorial regimes basically, persecuted. It's just not as direct as a sort of reaction to the times.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think what I'm questioning is the word direct, because maybe it's the most direct. It's just not representational. That's all. So I think I love the way her work makes me think about how abstraction can be engaged with the world even though it shuns a mimetic relation to that world. That's and don't you think, I don't know, here we've all been quarantined, right? And there's a crisis going around us, which I care deeply about. But if someone were to look at my practice from this last year, I'm not sure there is a representational relationship of that. Yeah, anyway, it's interesting.
And maybe Natalia and Walburga say a little bit more about that, because I think you're touching on an extremely important point. And also, thank you, of course, to Sophia Denisko, who was asking this question, leading into probably some of the essential problematics of how we understand abstraction. And I think, Anne, what you're saying is basically extremely important in terms of there is this possibility of reflecting upon how abstraction, in this case, Sophie Taeuber-Arp's abstraction, is precisely engaged, even while being not at all enmeshed within the representational logic. So I think that's a wonderful question, and it would be great if Natalia or Walburga, you want to add maybe something about that?
Can I ask maybe a question to Walburga, because it's a very interesting take indeed, and there are a few things I can think of, and one of them is that where we are currently in the Sophie Taeuber-Arp research is that we don't have a lot of her own voice out there. Walburga said the correspondence, which only recently became part of the public domain, hasn't been published. Walburga is editing the text right away. So at the time where we have access to her own thoughts and ideas as she shared them with her nearest and dearest, we would be in the better position to go deeply into socio-political, geopolitical situation, her other views. At the moment, we have snippets. We have things like, oh, she switched from German into French at some point. Was it a statement? Wasn't it a statement? There are more questions than answers. And I think the work Walburga is doing should actually help to clarify it. And it's a different page. Walburga, what do you think?
We are just talking about the moment when she switched from German to French, and that is she wrote it to her sister very simply because of the military control, and the letter has a stamp on the envelope that it has been opened by the military police. And when she said it will go quicker if I write French, because when they open it, they could read it easily, the French ones, you see. So German would be more complicated. They would have to ask a translator. And so to get the letters through quickly, she moved into French. But Sophie Taeuber-Arp is a very political person, you see. She is very early aware what is happening in Germany, and she's talking at a very early point about that in the correspondence to her family in Switzerland. She knows that her sister in one point has different opinion, and her brother as well, who is living in Munich and who has an antiquarian bookshop there. And but she's more openly talking about that with, her, for example, her collectors Annie and Oskar Müller-Wittmann in Basel, and this correspondence has been published recently. And yeah, she is reading newspapers, even French, German, Swiss newspapers, to see what is going on, to see what is the opinion, to see what will happen. And even in 31, she is talking about that there could be a war. She is seeing what has happened at the end of the 30s. She is very aware of that. But I think her art, you can't see it in her art. For example, you were talking about the marionettes, Eva. It's correct that there have only been 3 venues because of the pandemic, but she wrote in 28 to Hildebrand when he is preparing the book on women in art, that it was not only because of the pandemic, that it was because for the director of the Marionette Theatre and the regisseur, they have been too modern. She was too early with them in her time. So it was too modern, and so they don't want to make more venues.
Well, I think we're now at the time where we can cherish them and hold them in the highest regard, even though it's 100 years later. And it feels wonderful to be part of this moment. And I'm just incredibly proud and grateful to you all for having been here this evening, this morning, and with us. Yeah, and thank you for this inspiring conversation.
Well, thank you, Eva, for inviting us, for convening us, and yeah, to you and Daniel for being so gracious to include all of us. And bravo for being the pioneer to open the Sophie Taeuber-ARP show.
It's a bittersweet moment for us. And we're looking very much forward to having you all here in person if vaccination and travel and all of that allows in June. All right, so good night to everyone and have a good rest of the day, Anne.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye. Goodbye.